3 years after Storm vanished into the mountains, Jake Mercer found his horse waiting at the barn with a wild-born foal and eyes that screamed for help. Whatever Storm had left behind in that brutal high country was worth dying for, and the stallion had come to collect the only human he trusted to save it. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Jake Mercer stood at the edge of his ranch, staring out at the mountain ridges that had witnessed every triumph and tragedy of his 43 years. The morning sun painted the peaks in shades of gold and amber, the same colors that used to dance across the coat of the horse he had lost 3 years ago. 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days to be exact. Not that he was counting, though the calendar on his kitchen wall, marked with a small X on that terrible October morning, suggested otherwise. The ranch house behind him sat quiet in the valley, smoke curling from the chimney into the crisp Montana air. It was a good house, built by his grandfather's hands from timber cut in those very mountains, weathered by decades of harsh winters and scorching summers until it had become part of the landscape itself. 4 generations of Mercers had raised cattle, broken horses, and carved lives from this unforgiving terrain. But none of them had ever lost a horse the way Jake had lost Storm. Before we go any further, I want to know where you're watching from today. Drop a comment and let me know your location. And if this story touches your heart, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's story is going to absolutely blow your mind. Storm had been more than just a horse to Jake. He had been a partner, a companion, a friend who understood him better than most people ever had. The paint gelding had come into Jake's life on another autumn morning, 7 years ago now, when a traveling horse trader had passed through offering to sell off his remaining stock before winter set in. Jake had seen something in those intelligent brown eyes, some spark of spirit that matched his own restless soul. The horse had been young then, barely broken, with a coat that seemed to shift between black and white like storm clouds rolling across a summer sky. Hence the name. They had spent 3 years learning each other, horse and man moving as one across the rangeland, checking fence lines, herding cattle, riding out in weather that would have sent lesser partnerships back to the barn. Storm had personality for days, a stubborn streak when he thought Jake was making a poor decision, a gentle patience when Jake's mood turned dark, which happened more often than he liked to admit after his wife Sarah had passed from cancer. That horse had seen him through the worst year of his life, standing quiet in the barn while Jake wept against his neck, never judging, never pulling away, just being present in a way that humans often failed to manage. The morning Storm disappeared. Jake had risen before dawn as usual, pulled on his work boots, and headed to the barn with a thermos of coffee and plans to ride the northern fence line. But Storm's stall had stood empty, the gate hanging open, fresh tracks leading away into the darkness. At first, Jake had assumed he had failed to latch it properly the night before, that Storm had simply wandered off and would return by breakfast. Horses did that sometimes, especially smart ones who got bored with paddock life. But Storm never came back. Jake had searched for weeks. He had ridden every trail within 20 miles, called every neighbor within 50, posted notices in town and at the feed store, even hired a tracking service that specialized in finding lost livestock. They had found tracks leading up into the high country, into territory so rugged and remote that few people ventured there even in summer. The trackers had told him that Storm must have gone wild, joined up with a band of Mustangs that still roamed the highest peaks, or perhaps fallen victim to a mountain lion or a bad fall in the treacherous terrain. Either way, they said, he was gone. Jake should accept it, get himself a new horse, move on with his life. But Jake Mercer had never been good at moving on. His neighbors would tell you that with a knowing shake of their heads. Old Jake, they would say. He's the type who holds on to things. His grandfather's ranch when he could have sold it for good money and retired, his wife's clothes still hanging in the closet 3 years after her death. And now this obsession with a missing horse that was surely dead and gone. The ranch hands Jake employed seasonally had learned not to mention Storm's name. The empty stall in the barn remained empty, cleaned and bedded as if waiting for its occupant to return any day. Jake's daughter Emma, who lived 2 hours away in Billings with her husband and 2 kids, had tried several times to convince him to get another horse. She had even brought him brochures from a breeder, pictures of fine paint horses that looked enough like Storm to make his chest ache. But he had refused them all. Some things, he had told her, couldn't be replaced. The truth was that losing Storm had felt like losing Sarah all over again. Another piece of his life torn away without warning, leaving a hole that refused to close. He had survived Sarah's death because Storm had been there, solid and real and breathing, something alive that needed him to keep going. Without that anchor, Jake had drifted through the last 3 years like a ghost haunting his own property, going through the motions of ranch life but feeling disconnected from it all. He had stopped riding the northern fence line, let it fall into disrepair. What was the point of maintaining boundaries when the best part of his life had simply walked past them and vanished? The other ranch hands handled most of the horsework now, while Jake focused on the cattle and the endless administrative tasks that came with running a modern ranch. He told himself he was getting older, that it made sense to delegate the more physically demanding work. But the truth sat heavier on his conscience. He could not bear to ride another horse through country he had explored with Storm. This morning, though, something had pulled Jake from his bed earlier than usual. Some nameless restlessness that sent him to the porch with his coffee while the stars still glittered overhead. The feeling had been building for days now, like the pressure in the air before a thunderstorm. Jake had woken 3 times in the past week from dreams he could not quite remember, only the lingering sense that something was coming, something important he needed to be ready for. His foreman, Carlos, had noticed his distraction during their morning meetings about fall roundup plans. Even the cattle seemed to sense his unease, moving skittish around him in the holding pens. Jake drained the last of his coffee and set the cup on the porch rail, watching as the sun continued its slow climb above the eastern mountains. The ranch spread out before him in the growing light, 2,000 acres of grassland and timber that had sustained his family for nearly a century. His grandfather used to say that land had memory, that it held onto the footsteps of everyone who had ever walked it, every animal that had ever grazed it, every story that had ever unfolded beneath its sky. Jake had dismissed such talk as old man poetry when he was younger. Now, at 43 and feeling ancient himself, he wondered if there might be truth in it. A hawk called out overhead, its cry sharp and clear in the morning air. Jake watched it circle once, twice, then arrow off toward the north, toward the high country where Storm's tracks had disappeared 3 years ago. He felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to follow it, to saddle up one of the ranch horses and ride out toward those distant peaks, despite all his resolutions to stay away from that territory. The urge was so strong it almost felt like a physical pull, like someone had tied a rope around his chest and was tugging him forward. He shook his head, trying to clear it. This was foolishness, the kind of magical thinking that led men to waste their lives chasing ghosts and maybes. Storm was gone. The sooner he truly accepted that, the sooner he could begin to heal from this particular wound. Emma had been right when she visited last month and found him standing in Storm's empty stall at midnight, unable to sleep, unable to let go. She had held his hand and told him that sometimes love meant accepting when something was over, even when your heart wanted to keep fighting. But what did acceptance look like when every fiber of your being rejected it? How did you close a door when you kept hearing footsteps on the other side? Jake descended the porch steps and began his morning walk around the property, a habit ingrained over decades of ranch management. Check the barn, check the equipment shed, check the water troughs, walk the near pastures. These daily rituals kept him grounded when his thoughts threatened to spiral into darker territory. The ranch hands would not arrive for another hour, giving him this quiet time alone with the land and his memories. The barn smelled of hay and leather and horse, that distinctive combination that had meant home to Jake since childhood. 6 horses occupied the stalls now, good, solid ranch horses that did their jobs without complaint. He moved down the line, checking each one, murmuring greetings, running his hands over flanks and muzzles. They were fine animals. Any rancher would be proud to own them. But none of them were Storm. Storm's stall sat at the far end of the barn, still empty, still waiting. Jake had not been able to bring himself to fill it with another horse, despite the practical waste of good stall space. The other hands thought he was being sentimental, and maybe they were right. But sentiment was all he had left of some things, and he guarded it fiercely. He was standing there, one hand on the empty stall door, when he heard it, a sound so unexpected, so impossible that at first his brain refused to process it. A whinny, high and clear, coming from outside the barn. A particular whinny he had not heard in 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days. Jake's heart stopped. His hand tightened on the stall door until his knuckles went white. He told himself he was imagining things, that grief and lack of sleep were playing tricks on his mind. But then he heard it again, closer now, accompanied by the sound of hoofbeats on the hard-packed dirt of the ranch yard. He moved toward the barn door like a man in a dream, his legs carrying him forward while his mind struggled to catch up with what was happening. The morning sunlight seemed too bright as he stepped outside, forcing him to squint against the glare. And there, silhouetted against the mountains, stood a horse. Not just any horse. A paint gelding with a coat that shifted between black and white like storm clouds rolling across a summer sky. Older now, his mane longer and wild, his body showing the lean hardness of a horse that had survived on its own in rough country, but unmistakably, impossibly, Storm. Jake's legs nearly gave out beneath him. He grabbed the barn door frame for support, certain he must be hallucinating, that the stress and grief had finally broken something fundamental in his mind. Horses did not simply reappear after 3 years in the wilderness. They did not come home like dogs in those feel-good movies Emma's kids watched. This was not possible. But Storm took another step forward, and Jake could see the white blaze on his face, the particular way he held his head slightly cocked to the left, the small scar above his right eye from a wire fence encounter years ago. Every detail exactly as Jake remembered, exactly as he had seen in his dreams for 3 years. The horse whinnied again, softer this time, almost questioning. And Jake realized Storm was not alone. Behind Storm, partially hidden by his larger frame, stood a foal. Small, delicate, with a coat that glowed deep chestnut in the morning light. The young horse could not have been more than a few months old. It stayed close to Storm's side, its legs still carrying that gangly uncertainty of youth, its eyes wide and curious, as it observed this strange, 2-legged creature frozen in the barn doorway. Jake's mind struggled to process what he was seeing. Storm had returned, yes, but he had returned as a father. Somewhere in those 3 years of wilderness living, Storm had found a mate, had started a family, had built a life in the high country that Jake had assumed would kill him. And now, for reasons Jake could not begin to fathom, Storm had chosen to bring his offspring home. He took a tentative step forward, and Storm's ears pricked forward in recognition. The gelding, or what Jake had always believed was a gelding, took several steps toward him, closing the distance between them with that familiar ground-covering walk Jake had watched 1,000 times before. The foal followed close behind, trusting its father completely, taking courage from Storm's confident approach. Jake's eyes burned with tears he refused to let fall. He extended his hand slowly, the way he had done 7 years ago when Storm was young and uncertain, offering himself as something safe, something trustworthy. Storm stretched his neck forward, and then his muzzle was touching Jake's palm, warm breath ghosting across his skin, the physical reality of it, finally convincing Jake that this was not a dream or a grief-induced hallucination. His other hand came up to stroke Storm's face, fingers finding familiar patterns, the slight ridge of that old scar, the whirl of hair that spiraled in the wrong direction near his left ear. Storm leaned into the touch, eyes half closing in contentment, and made a low rumbling sound deep in his chest that Jake remembered as meaning comfort, safety, home. 3 years dissolved in an instant. The ache that had lived in Jake's chest since that October morning loosened its grip, allowing him to breathe fully for the first time in what felt like forever. He pressed his forehead against Storm's, breathing in the scent of him, horse and wilderness and mountain air, and let himself feel the full weight of what he had been carrying alone. "I thought you were dead," he whispered, his voice breaking on the words. "I thought I'd lost you forever." Storm snorted softly, as if to say he was harder to kill than that, and the sound was so perfectly characteristic of the horse Jake remembered that he laughed despite the tears now running freely down his weathered face. The foal, emboldened by its father's ease, took a careful step closer to investigate this emotional human with cautious interest. Jake pulled back to look at the young horse properly. The foal was a beauty, its chestnut coat rich and glowing with health despite the wilderness upbringing. It had inherited Storm's intelligent eyes and proud bearing, though its features were softer, more refined, suggesting its mother had been a different breed entirely. Perhaps one of those Mustang mares that still ran wild in the high country, descended from ranch horses that had escaped or been released over the decades. The mystery of Storm's transformation from gelding to stallion nagged at Jake's mind. He thought back to the day he had purchased Storm from that traveling trader, remembered signing papers that declared the horse gelded, remembered the trader's assurances. But looking at Storm now, at the evidence of his virility standing nervously at his side, Jake realized either the trader had been mistaken or had deliberately lied. It happened sometimes in horse trading, sellers trying to pass off intact males as geldings to make them seem more manageable, more valuable to certain buyers. It did not matter now. What mattered was that Storm had survived, had thrived even, in conditions that should have claimed him. What mattered was that he had come home, had remembered across 3 years and countless miles that this place, this barn, this man meant something worth returning to. The sound of a truck engine pulling into the ranch yard broke the moment. Carlos, arriving early to help with the morning feeding, climbed out of his battered Ford and froze when he saw the scene before him. His weathered face went pale, then flushed, his mouth opening and closing without sound as he tried to process the impossible sight. "That's not," he started, then stopped. "Boss, is that Storm?" Jake could not find his voice, could only nod as he kept one hand on Storm's neck, afraid that if he let go, the horse would vanish again like morning mist burned away by sunshine. The foal pressed closer to Storm, alarmed by the newcomer, and Storm shifted his body protectively, placing himself between his offspring and this potential threat. Carlos approached slowly, his experienced horseman's instincts telling him to move carefully, to avoid spooking animals that had clearly been living wild. When he got close enough to see Storm's distinctive markings clearly, to recognize the particular way the horse held himself, his face crumpled with emotion. Carlos had been there the day Storm disappeared, had ridden out with Jake on those first desperate search missions, had helped post those flyers around town. He had mourned the loss almost as deeply as Jake had. "Madre de Dios," Carlos breathed, making the sign of the cross. "It's really him. But how? Where has he been?" "The mountains," Jake said, finding his voice at last. "He's been up in the high country, and he found himself a family." Carlos's eyes widened when he noticed the foal for the first time, taking in its youth, its obvious health, the way it shadowed Storm's every movement. "A colt," he observed. "Fine-looking one, too. That's going to be one hell of a horse when it grows up if it has Storm's spirit." They stood together in the morning light, two men who had worked this land side by side for 15 years, witnessing something neither of them would have believed possible if they had not seen it with their own eyes. Other ranch hands began to arrive, their trucks kicking up dust on the long driveway, and word spread quickly. Storm had returned. Storm, who everyone had given up for dead, had walked back into Jake Mercer's life like he had only been gone for an afternoon ride. By mid-morning, half the county knew. Jake's phone rang constantly with neighbors calling to verify the rumor, to share in the miraculous news. But Jake barely heard any of it. He was focused entirely on Storm and the foal, moving slowly around them, assessing their condition with the careful eye of a man who had spent his entire life working with horses. Storm looked different than he remembered, leaner and harder, his muscles defined in ways that spoke of constant movement across difficult terrain. His hooves showed signs of natural wear, self-trimmed by miles of travel over rock and stone, though they would need professional attention soon. There were scars too, new ones that Jake cataloged with a heavy heart, evidence of fights with predators or other stallions, marks of survival carved into Storm's hide like a map of his wilderness years. But overall, Storm appeared healthy. His eyes were bright and alert, his coat beneath the dust and grime showed good condition, and his movements carried the confidence of a horse that had mastered his environment rather than merely survived it. Whatever life Storm had carved out for himself in the high country, it had agreed with him in ways that ranch life perhaps never fully had. The foal was another matter entirely. Young as it was, the little one showed remarkable composure for a wild-born horse suddenly confronted with human civilization. Most Mustang foals would be bucking and fighting at the mere proximity of humans, but this one stayed close to Storm while watching the activity around the ranch with intelligent curiosity rather than blind panic. Storm had clearly passed along more than just his physical traits. That famous temperament, the unique blend of spirit and trust that had made Storm so special, lived again in his offspring. Doc Hartley arrived just before noon, his veterinary truck rumbling into the yard with its familiar rattle of equipment and supplies. The old vet had been caring for Mercer Ranch animals since before Jake was born, had delivered Jake's first pony when he was 6 years old, had been there when Storm first came to the ranch 7 years ago. He climbed out of his truck with the deliberate movements of a man in his 70s who refused to let age slow him down, his weathered face breaking into an incredulous grin when he saw Storm standing in the corral Jake had moved them to. "Well, I'll be damned," Doc Hartley said, shaking his head in wonder. "Jake Mercer, you are either the luckiest son of a gun in Montana or that horse of yours is too stubborn to know when he's supposed to stay lost." Jake managed to smile despite the emotion still churning in his chest. "I think it's a bit of both, Doc. Can you check them over? Make sure they're really okay?" Doc Hartley approached the corral with the calm authority of someone who had examined thousands of horses over 5 decades of practice. Storm regarded him with recognition, remembering this human who had always brought treats in gentle hands, who had tended to minor injuries and administered vaccinations with minimal fuss. The old vet extended his hand, letting Storm catch his scent, re-establish their connection. "Hello, old friend," Doc murmured. "Heard you went and had yourself an adventure. Let's see what souvenirs you brought back." The examination took nearly an hour. Doc worked with practiced efficiency, checking Storm's eyes, teeth, heart, lungs, running his hands over every inch of the horse's body, noting each scar and healed injury. Jake watched anxiously, Carlos standing beside him with arms crossed, both men silent as they waited for the verdict. The foal received equal attention, though Doc had to work more carefully with the younger animal, letting it grow accustomed to human touch gradually, using Storm's calm presence to reassure the nervous youngster. Finally, Doc straightened up and turned to Jake with an expression that mixed professional assessment with genuine amazement. "He's in remarkably good shape, all things considered. Those scars tell stories I'm glad I wasn't there to witness, but they all healed clean. No infections, no ongoing issues. His hooves need trimming and his teeth could use some work. But honestly, Jake, for a horse that's been living wild for 3 years, Storm looks better than he has any right to. He's tough as nails and twice as lucky. Relief flooded through Jake's body, loosening muscles he had not realized were tensed. And the foal? Healthy as can be. I'd put it at about 4 months old, maybe 5. Good bone structure, strong legs, excellent conformation. Whatever mare Storm found himself, she passed along some quality genetics. This little one's going to grow up to be something special. The words confirmed what Jake had already suspected, but hearing it from Doc made it real in a way that settled something deep in his soul. Storm had not just survived, he had thrived. He had found freedom in those mountains, had lived a life wild and unfettered, and yet he had chosen to come back. That choice meant something Jake was still trying to fully comprehend. "There's something else you should know," Doc said, his tone shifting to something more serious. "Storm's got some behavioral changes you're going to need to account for. He's been running as a stallion for 3 years, living by stallion rules. He's protective, territorial, probably a lot more aggressive than you remember, especially where the foal's concerned. You're going to have to earn his trust all over again, not as the man he remembers, but as the man he's become." Jake nodded slowly, understanding the implications. The Storm he had known was gone in some fundamental way, replaced by this harder, wilder version. Their old partnership would need to be rebuilt from the ground up, if it could be rebuilt at all. Some horses went wild and never fully returned to domestic life, their spirits too changed by freedom to accept human authority again. But as he watched Storm gently nuzzle the foal, guiding it toward the water trough, Jake felt a stirring of hope. Storm had come home. He had brought his offspring home. That suggested the bond between horse and man was not as broken as Doc seemed to fear. "I understand," Jake said quietly. "We'll take it slow. Let him remember this place on his own terms." Doc Hartley clapped him on the shoulder. "You always were good with horses, Jake. If anyone can bring him back around, it's you. Just don't expect miracles overnight. 3 years is a long time in a horse's life." After Doc left, Jake spent the rest of the afternoon simply being present near the corral, not pushing, not demanding, just existing in Storm's space. He brought hay and fresh water, hung a salt lick, made sure both horses had everything they needed for comfort. The foal, bolder now, approached the fence several times to sniff at Jake with velvet-soft nostrils before dancing back to Storm's protective shadow. Emma arrived just before sunset, her SUV sliding to a dusty stop in the ranch yard. She climbed out with her phone already raised, tears streaming down her face before she even reached the corral. Jake had called her that morning, his voice shaking as he delivered news she had initially thought was a cruel joke or a sign that grief had finally broken her father's mind. But there Storm stood, solid and real, watching Emma's approach with ears pricked forward in recognition. "Dad," Emma breathed, her hand covering her mouth. "I can't believe it. I just can't believe it." Jake pulled her into a hug, feeling her tremble against him. "Neither can I, sweetheart. Neither can I." They stood together at the fence, watching as Storm moved around the corral with the foal trailing behind like a small chestnut shadow. Emma had grown up on this ranch, had learned to ride on gentle horses under Storm's watchful eye during those years when Storm had been Jake's constant companion. She had loved Storm almost as much as Jake had cried for days when the horse vanished, had spent her own hours searching the nearby trails before accepting that he was gone. "Where do you think he's been?" she asked softly. What kind of life was he living out there? Jake had been pondering the same questions all day, trying to piece together a story from the scars and the changes he observed in Storm's demeanor. "I think he went up into the really high country, beyond where we searched. There's still wild Mustang bands up there, descended from ranch stock that escaped over the years. He must have found one of those bands, fought his way into a harem, became a lead stallion. The image formed in Jake's mind as he spoke. Storm moving through alpine meadows with a band of mares, defending his territory against rival stallions, living by the ancient rhythms that horses had followed for millennia before humans ever thought to domesticate them. It was a powerful image, simultaneously beautiful and heartbreaking because it meant Storm had found something in the wilderness that ranch life had not provided. "But he came back," Emma said, as if reading his thoughts. "That has to mean something, Dad. He could have stayed up there forever, but he chose to come home." Jake nodded slowly, though the why of it still eluded him. Horses were not like dogs. They did not have the same attachment to human homes, the same instinct to return to their people. Once a horse went truly wild, it rarely chose domestication again. Storm's return defied everything Jake understood about equine behavior, suggested motivations he could not begin to guess at. "Tell me about the foal," Emma said, her professional curiosity as a large animal veterinarian overriding her emotional response. She had inherited Jake's love of horses and turned it into a career, working at a clinic in Billings that specialized in equine medicine. Her trained eye assessed the young horse with the same thoroughness Doc Hartley had shown. "Doc thinks 4 or 5 months old," Jake replied. "Healthy, good conformation, smart as a whip." Already showing Storm's temperament, curious but not stupid, bold but not reckless. "That's young to be traveling the kind of distance Storm must have covered getting here," Emma observed. "Most wild foals stay close to their birth territories for the first year at least. The journey down from the high country would be brutal for something that young, especially if Storm had to keep moving to avoid predators." The observation troubled Jake because it suggested another layer to the mystery. Why would Storm risk his offspring by bringing it on such a dangerous journey? What had driven him to leave the wilderness and return to human civilization at the precise moment when his foal was most vulnerable? The timing seemed deliberate, purposeful, as if Storm had been waiting for something specific before making the trek. Carlos appeared from the barn carrying an armload of clean blankets. "Thought the little one might appreciate some extra bedding tonight," he said, gesturing toward the foal. "Going to get cold once the sun goes down. Wild-born or not, that's still a baby that could use some comfort." They worked together to prepare the horses for their first night back at the ranch. Storm accepted the clean stall with apparent pleasure, moving into it with the confidence of a horse who remembered this place and found it good. The foal was more hesitant, requiring patient coaxing before finally following its father into the unfamiliar enclosed space. Jake hung a heat lamp in the corner, mindful of the dropping temperatures and the foal's tender age. As darkness settled over the ranch, Jake found himself unable to leave the barn. He dragged an old camp chair from the tack room and positioned it outside Storm's stall, settling in for a vigil he could not explain but felt compelled to maintain. Emma joined him with 2 cups of coffee and a thick blanket, draping it over both their shoulders as they sat together in the comfortable silence that came from a lifetime of shared understanding. "I used to sit out here when Mom was sick," Jake said quietly, the words surprising him even as he spoke them. "Those last few months when the pain was bad and she couldn't sleep. Storm would hang his head over the stall door and just stand with me. Never made a sound, never got restless. Just kept me company through the worst nights of my life." Emma's hand found his and squeezed. "I remember. You'd come in at dawn smelling like horse and hay, and Mom would smile because she knew Storm was taking care of you when she couldn't." The memory ached with a particular sweetness. Loss and love intertwined so completely they could not be separated. Sarah had understood Jake's bond with Storm in ways that transcended simple horse ownership. She had joked that she was married to 2 males, one human and one equine, and that she was not entirely sure which one understood her husband better. "You think that's why he came back?" Emma asked. Because he knew you needed him again? Jake wanted to dismiss the idea as anthropomorphic fantasy, the kind of magical thinking that led people to attribute human emotions and motivations to animals. But he had spent enough years working with horses to know they were far more perceptive than most people credited. They read body language and emotional states with uncanny accuracy, formed deep bonds that transcended simple training relationships, grieved and celebrated in ways that suggested complex inner lives. "I don't know," he admitted finally, "but I do know that 3 years ago I needed him desperately and he wasn't here. And now he's back. And I realize I still need him just as much as I did then. Maybe more." Inside the stall, Storm stood quietly with the foal pressed against his side, both horses drowsy but alert, adjusting to their new environment. The foal's eyes were already drooping, exhaustion from the long journey finally catching up with it now that safety and comfort had been secured. Storm remained watchful, protective, his head raised and ears mobile, tracking every sound in the barn with the vigilance of an animal that had learned to sleep light and wake fast. The first week tested Jake's patience in ways he had not anticipated. Storm was simultaneously familiar and foreign, responding to some old commands while ignoring others, accepting Jake's presence one moment and warning him off the next with flattened ears and bared teeth. The wild stallion lived just beneath the surface of the domesticated horse Jake remembered, and that wildness erupted unpredictably, especially when the foal was involved. Carlos witnessed one such episode on the third morning when he approached the corral with a bucket of grain. Storm charged the fence with fury in his eyes, hooves striking the ground in warning, body positioned between Carlos and the foal. The ranch foreman had worked with difficult horses his entire life, but even he stepped back from the raw aggression Storm displayed. "That is not the same horse," Carlos said later, his voice carrying equal parts respect and concern. "That is something wild that remembers being tame, but has not decided if it wants to be again." Jake could not argue with the assessment. Each interaction with Storm felt like negotiation between two different versions of the horse, the before and after of those 3 wilderness years locked in constant battle. Sometimes the old Storm emerged, gentle and trusting, pressing his forehead against Jake's chest in that gesture of affection Jake had thought he would never experience again. Other times the wild stallion dominated, all power and suspicion, treating Jake like a potential threat to be monitored and managed. But Jake persisted with the quiet determination that had sustained him through 43 years of ranch life. He spent hours each day simply existing near the horses, talking to them in low tones, moving slowly and predictably, rebuilding trust one small moment at a time. He brought treats Storm had once loved, carrots and apples, sugar cubes secreted in his pocket for strategic deployment. The foal proved easier to win over, its youth making it more adaptable, its curiosity overcoming its caution. By the end of the first week, the foal would eat from Jake's hand, would allow him to run gentle fingers down its neck, would even follow him a few steps away from Storm's protective presence. Jake named the young horse Ember, for the way its chestnut coat seemed to glow like banked coals in the morning light. Emma had suggested the name during one of her evening visits, and it fit so perfectly that Jake adopted it immediately. Storm watched these interactions with apparent approval, his body language softening gradually as he observed that Jake posed no threat to his offspring. It was a turning point Jake recognized from years of horse training, the moment when a protective parent decides you have proven yourself worthy of trust. Storm began allowing Jake closer, accepting touches that lasted longer, standing still for grooming sessions that revealed more scars and told more stories of survival. One evening, as Jake brushed Storm's coat until it shone in the barn light, he discovered a particular scar that made his breath catch. It ran along Storm's left flank, jagged and deep, the kind of wound that should have been fatal. Jake traced it carefully, imagining the encounter that had created it, Mountain lion, probably, or perhaps a rival stallion's hooves during a territorial dispute. Either way, Storm had survived an injury that would have killed a lesser horse, had kept himself and his band safe despite carrying that wound through healing. "You fought hard for the life you built up there," Jake murmured, his fingers gentle on the scarred hide. "And yet you gave it up to come back here. Why, old friend? What brought you home?" Storm turned his head to look at Jake with those intelligent brown eyes that seemed to hold answers to questions Jake did not know how to ask. For a moment, the wildness receded completely, and Jake saw only the horse he had loved and lost, the companion who had carried him through his darkest hours. Then Storm nickered softly and returned his attention to the hay net, the moment passing like sunlight through clouds. The answer came unexpectedly on a Tuesday afternoon when Jake was working in the north pasture, repairing fence line he had neglected for 3 years. Storm appeared on the ridge above him, having somehow escaped his corral. Jake's heart lurched with fear that the horse was leaving again, running back to the wilderness that had claimed him. But Storm simply stood there on the ridge, silhouetted against the afternoon sky, watching Jake work. After several minutes, the horse began picking his way down the slope toward the pasture, moving with the careful precision of an animal that had navigated far more treacherous terrain. He stopped at the fence line, on the wild side of it, and looked at Jake expectantly. It took Jake a moment to understand what Storm was showing him. This fence marked the boundary between domestication and wilderness, between the life Storm had lived and the life he had returned to. And Storm was standing on the wild side, having chosen to come back to that boundary even when he was free to run. Jake set down his tools and walked to the fence, one hand extended. Storm met him there, pressing his muzzle into Jake's palm, and in that moment Jake finally understood. Storm had not come back because he wanted to be domesticated again. He had come back because he wanted Jake to be part of his world, whatever form that world took. The horse was not asking to be owned. He was offering partnership on new terms, a relationship that honored both the wild thing he had become and the bond they had once shared. "You want to show me, don't you?" Jake said quietly. "You want me to see what you found up there, where you've been, why you came back with Ember?" Storm pulled away from Jake's hand and turned to look back toward the mountains, toward the high country, where he had spent 3 years building a life Jake could only imagine. Then he looked back at Jake, and the invitation in his eyes was unmistakable. "Come with me. See what I've seen. Understand why I had to bring my offspring to you." The idea was madness. Jake was 43 years old with a ranch to run and responsibilities he could not simply abandon. The high country Storm had survived in was brutal terrain that challenged even experienced wilderness guides. Going up there in late autumn with winter approaching would be dangerous at best, suicidal at worst. Every practical bone in Jake's body screamed against it. But another part of him, the part that had died a little when Storm vanished, the part that had come back to life the moment Storm appeared in the ranch yard, that part whispered yes. This was why Storm had returned. Not to resume the life they had before, but to bridge the gap between his two worlds, to share with Jake something precious enough to risk the dangerous journey with a young foal. Emma thought he had lost his mind when he told her his plan that evening over dinner. She set down her fork with enough force to make the plate rattle, her expression shifting from surprise to anger to fear in the space of a single breath. "Dad, you cannot be serious. Following Storm into the high country this time of year? That's a death wish wrapped up in sentiment." Jake had expected her reaction, had prepared himself for it, but the fear in her eyes still cut deep. "He's asking me to come, Em. Not demanding, not forcing. Asking. And I need to know why. I need to understand what he's trying to show me." "What he's trying to show you is that he's wild now," Emma countered, her voice rising. "That he belongs up there, not down here. And if you follow him, you'll either freeze to death or break your neck falling off some cliff. and I will have lost both my parents before I turn 35. The words hung heavy in the kitchen. Sarah's absence a presence as real as any living person. Jake reached across the table to take his daughter's hand, feeling the calluses that marked her as someone who worked with her hands despite the veterinary degree, despite the comfortable life she had built in the city. I'm not abandoning you, sweetheart, and I'm not going to die up there. Storm survived 3 winters in that country. If he can do it, so can I. Storm is a horse, Emma said flatly. You're a middle-aged man with arthritis in your left knee and a tendency to take stupid risks when you're feeling emotional. She was not wrong about any of that. Jake's knee did ache something fierce on cold mornings, legacy of a bull riding accident in his 20s that had never quite healed right. And he had made more than his share of questionable decisions when grief or loneliness clouded his judgment, but this felt different. This felt necessary in a way he could not adequately explain to his daughter or even to himself. Carlos was equally opposed to the idea when Jake briefed him the next morning on the ranch operations he would need to handle alone for however long this journey took. The foreman listened in silence as Jake outlined where the cattle needed to be moved, which fences needed attention, what suppliers to contact for winter feed. When Jake finally ran out of instructions, Carlos simply shook his head. You know this is crazy, boss. You know that, right? Jake nodded. I know. And you're going anyway. I'm going anyway. Carlos was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face thoughtful. Then he walked to his truck and returned with a battered GPS unit and a satellite phone. You take these. You check in every day at sunset, or I'm calling search and rescue. And you take a gun. I don't care if Storm brought you an engraved invitation. There's more than weather and terrain that can kill a man up there. The preparation took 3 days. Jake assembled camping gear he had not used in years, sleeping bag rated for sub-zero temperatures, lightweight tent designed for alpine conditions, portable stove, and enough freeze-dried food to last 2 weeks. He packed medical supplies, water purification tablets, rope, emergency flares, everything the outdoor supply store clerk insisted was essential for wilderness survival. His saddlebags became so heavy with provisions that he had to redistribute weight twice to achieve proper balance. Emma helped despite her objections, her professional knowledge ensuring he had adequate first aid supplies for both himself and any horse emergencies he might encounter. She packed antibiotics, pain medication, bandages, sutures, a snake bite kit, constantly muttering under her breath about stubborn men and foolish quests. But her hands were gentle as she checked and rechecked his supplies, making sure nothing essential was forgotten. The morning of departure arrived cold and clear, frost painting the ranch in silver as Jake saddled one of his reliable ranch horses, a steady bay mare named Juniper who had the endurance for mountain travel. Storm watched the preparations with keen interest, and when Jake led Juniper from the barn, Storm moved to the corral gate and waited expectantly. Ember pressed close to his father's side, clearly distressed by the activity, sensing something significant was about to occur. Jake opened the gate, half expecting Storm to bolt immediately for the mountains. Instead, the stallion walked calmly out, pausing to touch noses with Ember in what appeared to be reassurance before taking up position beside Juniper. The 2 horses regarded each other warily, establishing their hierarchy through subtle body language. Storm was clearly dominant, but he showed no aggression toward the mare, seeming to understand that she was necessary for this journey. Ember began to follow, but Storm turned and blocked the foal's path with his body, nickering firmly. The message was clear. You stay here where it's safe. This journey is not for you. The foal protested, calling out anxiously, but Storm was unmoved. He had brought Ember home for a reason, and that reason apparently involved leaving the young horse in human care while he led Jake back to the high country. Emma emerged from the house with a thermos of coffee and tears streaming down her face. She handed Jake the thermos and then wrapped her arms around him in a fierce hug. You better come back, she whispered against his chest. "You better damn well come back or I will never forgive you." "I'll come back," Jake promised, though he could not quite silence the small voice that wondered if he was lying. "I have too much to live for not to come back." He swung into Juniper's saddle, settling his weight and checking his gear one final time. Storm moved to the front, taking up the lead position without being asked, and began walking toward the northern trail that led up into the foothills. Jake touched his heels to Juniper's sides, and they followed, leaving behind the ranch, the safety of civilization, everything familiar and known. Carlos stood in the ranch yard beside Emma, one arm around her shoulders, watching them go. Jake turned in his saddle to wave, seeing them both framed against the ranch house that had been home to 4 generations of Mercers. Then he faced forward and gave himself over to Storm's guidance, trusting the horse to lead him wherever this strange pilgrimage was meant to go. The first 2 days of travel passed through country Jake knew well, foothills and lower elevations where he had ridden countless times over the years. Storm moved with purposeful confidence, choosing trails that showed signs of recent use, hoof prints and droppings that suggested other horses had passed this way. Wild Mustang bands, Jake realized, following the same routes Storm had learned during his wilderness years. The stallion was retracing his journey home, leading Jake back along the path he had taken with Ember just weeks before. Juniper handled the terrain well, her steady temperament never faltering even when Storm's choice of route seemed questionable to Jake's experienced eye. The mare had enough mountain experience to pick her footing carefully, to navigate loose scree and steep switchbacks without panic. At night, Jake made camp in sheltered spots that Storm seemed to select deliberately, places protected from wind where water was accessible and grazing adequate for the horses. The weather held cold but clear, giving them blue skies and crisp air that made every breath feel like swallowing ice. Jake checked in with Carlos each evening as promised, his messages brief but reassuring. "All good. Making progress. Storm knows where he's going." Carlos's responses were equally terse, though Jake could read the worry between the words. Ember settling in. Emma visited twice. Don't do anything stupid. On the 3rd day, they climbed above the tree line into alpine country that tested both Jake's endurance and his resolve. The air thinned until every breath required conscious effort, and the temperature dropped low enough that ice formed on Juniper's whiskers. Storm pushed on relentlessly, pausing only when absolutely necessary for rest and food, his body language suggesting urgency that had not been present in the lower elevations. Jake began to understand that Storm was racing against something, probably the weather. This high up, a storm could materialize with terrifying speed, trapping travelers in conditions no amount of preparation could overcome. If Storm wanted to reach his destination and return before winter truly settled in, they could not afford delays. The realization added weight to Jake's already considerable anxiety, but he kept his fears private, trusting that Storm had made this journey successfully once already and would not lead them into certain death. The landscape at this elevation was stark and beautiful in ways that took Jake's breath away for reasons beyond the thin air. Granite peaks thrust skyward like the bones of the earth itself, their faces carved by millennia of wind and ice into formations that seemed almost architectural. Alpine meadows, brown now with autumn's touch, stretched between the peaks, and hidden lakes reflected the sky like shards of broken mirror. This was country few humans ever saw, pristine and ancient, existing in a timeless realm where human concerns meant nothing. On the 4th evening, as Jake set up camp in the lee of a massive boulder, he spotted movement on a distant ridge. Horses, a band of perhaps 15, moving in a loose group led by a magnificent dun mare. Even at this distance, Jake could see their wild grace, the way they flowed across the terrain like water seeking the path of least resistance. Storm raised his head and called out, a long, challenging whinny that echoed off the surrounding peaks. Several horses in the distant band answered, their calls carrying clearly in the thin air. Storm stood rigid, every muscle tense, and for a terrible moment Jake thought the stallion would bolt, would abandon him here to rejoin the wild family he had temporarily left. But Storm held his ground, though his entire body vibrated with the effort of staying. The message was clear. That band was part of Storm's past, connections he maintained but would not return to, not yet, not until he had completed whatever mission drove him. The wild horses disappeared over the ridge, and Storm finally relaxed, returning to graze as if nothing significant had occurred. But Jake understood he had just witnessed something profound. Storm's world was larger and more complex than Jake had imagined, filled with relationships and obligations that transcended the simple horse-human bond they had once shared. That night, Jake lay in his tent listening to the wind howl across the peaks and thought about Emma's words. Storm is wild now. He belongs up here, not down here. She had been right in ways Jake was only beginning to comprehend. Storm did belong here in this harsh, beautiful country where only the strongest and smartest survived. Yet the stallion had chosen to maintain connection to Jake's world as well, to bridge these two realms in ways that defied conventional understanding of equine behavior. The fifth day brought them to a narrow pass between two towering peaks, the trail so treacherous that Jake dismounted and led Juniper by hand, trusting his own feet more than his seat in the saddle. Storm navigated the passage with practiced ease, pausing periodically to ensure Jake and Juniper were managing. The wind funneled through the pass with enough force to make conversation impossible, to make Jake lean hard into its push just to maintain his footing. When they emerged on the far side, the landscape opened into a hidden valley that stole what little breath Jake had remaining. A vast meadow stretched before them, sheltered on all sides by sheer cliffs that created a natural fortress against weather and predators. A stream cut through the center, its water so clear Jake could see individual stones on the bottom from hundreds of feet away. And scattered across the meadow, grazing peacefully in the afternoon light, were more horses than Jake had ever seen outside of a professional ranch. Storm called out again, and this time the response was immediate and enthusiastic. Horses began moving toward them from across the valley, dozens of them, every color and build imaginable. Pintos and bays, sorrels and grays, sturdy mountain-bred animals that bore the stamp of both wild freedom and distant domestic ancestry. They surrounded Storm with obvious affection, touching noses, nickering greetings, welcoming him home like a king returning to his kingdom. Jake watched in awe as Storm moved among them, re-establishing connections, asserting his authority through subtle gestures of dominance that the other horses accepted without challenge. This was Storm's band, the family he had built during 3 years of wilderness living. These were the horses he had protected and led, the community he had chosen when ranch life no longer satisfied something essential in his spirit. But Storm did not lose himself in the reunion. After several minutes of greeting, he turned back to Jake and called imperatively, demanding attention. Jake urged Juniper forward, feeling like an intruder in this wild horse parliament, but Storm's body language made it clear that Jake's presence was not just tolerated, but required. Storm led him through the band toward the far end of the valley where the cliffs created a natural shelter, a deep overhang that would provide protection from the worst weather. As they approached, Jake noticed several horses standing in a protective semicircle, their bodies tense with concern. Storm nickered softly and the horses parted to reveal what they were guarding. A mare lay on her side in the sheltered space, her breathing labored and shallow. She was a stunning buckskin with a black mane and tail, her coat dulled by illness but still showing traces of the beauty she must have possessed in health. 3 foals huddled near her, 2 slightly older than Ember, 1 younger, all showing signs of distress and confusion. The mare's eyes tracked Storm's approach, and something in her expression made Jake's throat tighten. This was Storm's mate, the mother of his offspring, and she was dying. Jake dismounted immediately, his rancher's instincts overriding his awe at the situation. He approached slowly, letting the mare see him clearly, speaking in the low, calm tones he had always used with frightened or injured animals. Storm moved to the mare's head, touching his muzzle to hers in a gesture so tender it made Jake's eyes burn with unexpected tears. The stallion looked back at Jake, and the message in his gaze was unmistakable. Help her. That's why I brought you here. Help her the way you helped me all those years. Jake knelt beside the mare, running his hands carefully over her body, trying to assess what was wrong. She was thin, far thinner than she should be, her ribs visible beneath her coat. Her temperature was elevated, her gums pale, her breathing rapid and shallow. As Jake examined her more closely, he found what he was looking for, a deep wound on her left hindquarter, infected and festering, the kind of injury that would prove fatal without treatment. Mountain lion, probably, Jake murmured, his fingers gentle around the inflamed tissue. Weeks old, maybe a month. She's been fighting this infection the whole time, trying to stay strong for her foals, but she's losing the battle. Storm stood over them both, his presence protective but not interfering, trusting Jake to do what was necessary. The other horses maintained their vigil, this wild band that had accepted Jake's intrusion because Storm vouched for him. Jake felt the weight of their collective hope, their faith in Storm's judgment that this human could accomplish what they could not. He returned to Juniper and unpacked the medical supplies Emma had insisted he bring, blessing his daughter's foresight with every item he retrieved. Antibiotics, wound cleaning solution, bandages, pain medication. He had enough to treat a horse for several days, maybe a week if he was careful with dosing. Whether it would be enough to save this mare's life was another question entirely, but he had to try. The treatment process was long and delicate. Jake cleaned the wound as thoroughly as possible, the mare trembling beneath his touch but holding still with remarkable courage. Storm remained at her head throughout, nuzzling her gently, providing comfort through his presence. Jake administered antibiotics and pain medication, calculating dosages based on the mare's estimated weight, praying he was getting it right without Emma's expertise to guide him. As he worked, Jake began to understand the full scope of Storm's incredible journey. The stallion had left this valley with Ember, the youngest and most vulnerable of his offspring, traveling brutal terrain with a foal barely old enough for such a trek. He had brought Ember to the only place Storm knew the young horse would be safe, to the only human Storm trusted completely, and then Storm had returned immediately to lead Jake back here, racing against time and weather, because his mate was dying and his other foals were too young to survive without their mother. It was not about nostalgia or sentiment or the human-horse bond that Jake had mourned for 3 years. It was about survival, about a father doing whatever necessary to save his family. Storm had needed Jake's knowledge, his medical supplies, his human ability to heal in ways wild horses could not. The stallion had bridged 2 worlds not out of desire, but out of desperate necessity. "You could have asked me 3 years ago," Jake said quietly as he finished bandaging the wound. "You could have stayed and had all this without the suffering." But even as he spoke the words, he knew they were false. Storm needed to be wild first, needed to discover that part of himself before he could understand how to balance both lives. The stallion had found freedom and family in these mountains, had built something precious here that could not have existed within the boundaries of ranch domestication. The mare's breathing eased slightly as the pain medication took effect, and her eyes closed in exhausted relief. Storm nickered softly to the 3 foals, who crept forward cautiously to nestle against their mother's side. The oldest, a paint like Storm but with more brown than black, regarded Jake with intelligent eyes that reminded him heartbreakingly of Ember. The middle foal was a bay with a white star, already showing signs of the sturdy build that would make it a survivor in this harsh country. The youngest, barely 2 months old, was another buckskin like its mother, so small and vulnerable that Jake's heart clenched looking at it. These were Storm's children, his legacy, the reason he had risked everything to bring Jake here. If the mare died, these foals would struggle to survive the coming winter, even with the band's protection. They needed their mother's milk, her guidance, her warmth during the coldest nights. Storm had known this, had understood that saving his mate meant saving his offspring, and had been willing to cross every boundary between wild and domestic to make it happen. Jake set up his tent near the overhang, establishing himself as the mare's guardian and nurse. The other horses gradually accepted his presence, some approaching curiously to sniff at his gear, others maintaining wary distance. Storm moved between Jake and the mare, between the domestic world he had briefly returned to and the wild life he had built here, a bridge between realms that should have been irreconcilable. That evening, as Jake administered the second round of medication and checked the mare's vital signs, he called Carlos on the satellite phone. The connection was poor this high up, filled with static and delay, but Carlos's relief at hearing his voice came through clearly. "You found what you were looking for, boss?" Jake looked at Storm standing guard over his family, at the three foals who would grow up with a story about how their father had walked out of the wilderness to bring back a human healer. He thought about Ember's safe at the ranch, about Emma's fear and Carlos's loyalty, about the complex web of connections that tied them all together across the boundary between civilization and wildness. "Yeah, Carlos, I found it. I found exactly what I needed to find." The mare's name, Jake learned through observation and Storm's clear communication, was something the band called her, with a particular nickering sound he could not quite replicate. He took to calling her Grace for the dignified way she endured his treatments, never fighting him, despite the pain he must have caused cleaning that terrible wound. For 5 days, Jake lived among the wild horses, administering medications, changing bandages, monitoring her recovery with the intensity of a man who understood that more than one life hung in the balance. The infection fought back viciously those first 3 days. Grace's fever spiked, her body shaking with chills despite the extra blankets Jake draped over her, despite Storm's body heat as the stallion lay beside her through the coldest hours. Jake barely slept, checking her condition every few hours, adjusting medication dosages, praying to gods he had not spoken to since Sarah's death that this mare would live. On the 4th morning, Grace lifted her head on her own for the first time, her eyes clearer than they had been since Jake arrived. She drank water from the bucket he offered, and later that day she managed to stand for a few minutes, her legs trembling with effort but holding her weight. Storm watched these small victories with an intensity that reminded Jake of how he had felt watching Emma take her first steps, that mixture of pride and relief and overwhelming love that transcends species. By the 6th day, Grace was grazing alongside the other horses, her wound showing healthy signs of healing, the infection finally yielding to modern medicine and her own remarkable constitution. The foals, sensing their mother's recovery, became playful again, racing across the meadow in games of tag that made the whole band seem lighter, more joyful. Storm joined them occasionally, playing the indulgent father, letting them climb on his back and nip at his mane with the patience only a parent could muster. Jake knew it was time to leave. The weather was changing, clouds building over the peaks in ways that promised snow within days. If he waited much longer, the pass would become impassable, trapping him here until spring. He packed his gear with reluctance, having fallen in love with this hidden valley and the wild horses who had accepted his presence. This place existed outside of time, outside of human concerns about mortgages and responsibilities, and the endless tasks of ranch management. Here, life simplified to its essential elements: food, water, shelter, family. Storm walked with him to the edge of the valley where the trail began its descent, and for a long moment they stood together looking back at the band. Grace grazed peacefully with her foals scattered around her, the oldest already showing independence, the youngest still, rarely straying from her side. The other horses moved through their daily routines, grazing and playing and establishing the social bonds that held their community together. "You built something beautiful here," Jake said softly, one hand on Storm's neck. something worth fighting for, worth risking everything to protect. Storm turned to look at him, and Jake saw in those brown eyes a depth of understanding that went beyond typical horse cognition. They had always had this connection, this ability to communicate across the species barrier in ways that felt almost supernatural. But it had deepened through this journey, strengthened by shared purpose and mutual trust. The descent took 4 days, Jake pushing harder than he probably should have, driven by the weather nipping at his heels and Emma's increasingly worried phone messages. He made it through the pass just hours before the first major storm hit, snow beginning to fall as he reached the relative safety of the tree line. Storm stayed with him the entire way, ensuring Jake navigated safely, occasionally choosing alternate routes when weather made the main trail too dangerous. When they finally rode into the ranch yard on a gray afternoon with snow falling thick and fast, Emma burst from the house and ran to meet them, tears streaming down her face. She threw her arms around Jake before he could dismount, holding him so tightly he could barely breathe, and he realized how much fear she had carried during his absence. "You're okay," she kept repeating. "You're really okay." "I'm okay, sweetheart. Storm took good care of me." Emma looked up at the stallion with new respect. "Thank you," she said, speaking directly to the horse. "Thank you for bringing him home." Storm nickered softly in response, then moved toward the corral where Ember waited. The reunion between father and offspring was joyful and boisterous, Ember racing circles around Storm while the stallion touched noses with the foal he had entrusted to human care. They were family, Jake realized, not in the conventional sense of ownership and domestication, but in a deeper way that honored both the wild and the tame. Over the following weeks, Storm settled into a new pattern of life. He stayed at the ranch through the worst of winter, accepting Jake's care and shelter, allowing himself to be groomed and fed. But his spirit remained fundamentally wild, and Jake understood that come spring, Storm would return to his valley and his band. The stallion had not come back to be owned. He had come back to forge a partnership that honored both their natures. Emma visited more frequently now, fascinated by Storm's story, and eager to meet Grace when spring made the journey possible. She brought her children, Jake's grandchildren, to meet Ember and hear the story of the horse who walked out of the wilderness seeking help for his family. The tale grew in the telling, becoming legend among the local ranching community, a story about trust and intelligence, and the bonds that transcend the boundaries humans draw between wild and domestic. On the first warm day of spring, Jake woke to find Storm standing at the corral gate looking toward the mountains. The stallion's body language was clear. It was time. Time to return to Grace and the foals, to the band that waited in the hidden valley, to the life Storm had built in that pristine wilderness. Jake opened the gate without hesitation. He had learned during their journey that love sometimes meant letting go, that the deepest bonds could survive distance and absence. Storm stepped through the gate, then paused and looked back at Jake with what could only be described as gratitude. "I'll be here when you need me," Jake said. "Always." Storm whinnied once, the sound carrying clearly in the mountain air, then turned and began the journey home. Jake watched until the stallion disappeared into the foothills, feeling not the crushing grief he had experienced 3 years ago, but a peaceful acceptance. Storm would return, probably next autumn, possibly bringing all his foals to meet the human who had saved their mother. Or perhaps he would stay in his valley, living the wild life he had chosen. And that would be okay too. Ember moved to stand beside Jake at the fence, the young horse already showing signs of becoming as magnificent as its father. Together they watched the mountains, and Jake thought about the different kinds of family, the different ways love manifested. He had spent 3 years mourning a loss that had never really been a loss at all, just a transformation he had not understood. Storm had not left him. Storm had grown into something larger than the boundaries of ranch fences could contain. And by bringing Jake into his wild world, by showing him grace in the folds and the hidden valley where wildness still thrived, Storm had given Jake a gift more precious than simple companionship. He had given him purpose renewed, wonder restored, proof that even at 43 with arthritis in his knee and too many losses behind him, life still held miracles worth witnessing. The snow began to melt, revealing the green grass underneath. Spring was coming, bringing with it the promise of new beginnings, new stories, new chances to bridge the gap between the world humans built and the world that existed before them and would continue after them. Jake turned from the fence and walked back to the ranch house, Emma's laughter drifting from the kitchen where she was making breakfast with her children. He had gone into the mountains seeking answers and had found something better. He had found acceptance of what Storm had become, pride in what they had accomplished together, and hope that their story was far from over. In his pocket, his phone buzzed with a text from Carlos asking about the day's work schedule. Life continued, ordinary and necessary and good. But when Jake looked toward the mountains, he carried with him the memory of a hidden valley where wild horses ran free, where a stallion had built a kingdom, and where love manifested not as possession, but as partnership across impossible boundaries. Storm would return when he needed to, and Jake would be ready, always ready, to answer whatever call came from the high country where his horse had finally found home.